The attorney cleared his throat and reached for the second envelope. Nobody had known there was a second envelope. The first had taken 11 minutes to read. Standard distribution. The car to my cousin Brent. The savings account split between my father and my Uncle Dale. The furniture divided by a list my grandfather had apparently typed himself on a 1987 typewriter because the font was unmistakable. My Uncle Dale had been nodding since the first paragraph, the slow, satisfied nod of a man receiving what he had been expecting. Dale was the oldest son. Dale had driven my grandfather to his medical appointments for the last 2 years. Dale had positioned himself, with the patience of someone who understood that proximity was a form of argument, as the natural heir to the one thing that actually mattered: the house. 3,000 square feet on a double lot in the Harleston Village neighborhood of Charleston, built in 1931. My grandfather had bought it in 1962 for $11,000. It was currently worth approximately $2.1 million. Dale had been managing his anticipation for 4 years. The attorney finished reading the first envelope. He looked up. He looked around the room. My Uncle Dale, my father, my Aunt Sandra, my 2 cousins Brent and Michelle, and me. Then he reached into his briefcase and placed a second envelope on the table. Dale said, "What is that?" The attorney said, "This was provided to me separately with instructions to open it after the primary document." Dale said, "Nobody mentioned a second document." The attorney said, "Your father mentioned it to me. He asked that I keep it until today." The room was very quiet. The attorney opened the second envelope. My grandfather's handwriting was on the first page. I had not seen his handwriting in 4 years, since before the dementia had taken the steady part of his hand. This was the old handwriting, the careful architectural print of a man who had spent 40 years as a structural engineer and who had brought precision to everything, including the way letters sat on a line. The attorney began to read. "My name is Claire Beaumont. I am 32 years old. My grandfather, Henry Beaumont, died in October at 87. He had been a structural engineer, a widower since 1998, a man of few words and very specific opinions, who had spent the last decade of his life in the house on Harleston Village Street, with a rotating schedule of family visitors and a housekeeper named Gloria, who understood him better than most of us did. I visited every month, not out of obligation, because I liked him. Because the conversations we had were different from the conversations I had with anyone else. My grandfather did not smooth things. He did not manage feelings. He said what he observed, and he listened to what you said, and he responded to what you actually meant, rather than what you had politely implied. We talked about my work. I am an architect, which he considered a reasonable profession with several fundamental flaws he was always willing to enumerate. We talked about the house, which he loved with the specific attachment of someone who had spent 60 years maintaining something and understood every system inside it. We talked about the family, which he observed with the detached clarity of someone who had long since stopped needing anyone's approval. He never talked about the will. Not once in 32 years of monthly visits did he mention what he was planning. I found out what he had been planning when the attorney opened the second envelope. My Uncle Dale is 64 years old. He is the oldest of my grandfather's 3 children. My father Thomas is second. My Aunt Sandra is youngest. Dale is not a bad person. I want to say this clearly because the easy version of this story requires a villain, and Dale is not quite that. He is a person who decided, at some point in the past decade, that the Charleston house was his by right of position, oldest son, most present, most invested, and who had organized his behavior around that assumption with the specific thoroughness of someone who believes their claim is legitimate. He had driven my grandfather to appointments. He had attended the medical consultations. He had managed the house repairs and the insurance and the annual property tax review. He had done these things genuinely and helpfully, and also strategically, and the two motivations had coexisted so smoothly that I think Dale himself had long since stopped being able to separate them. My father had watched this for years with the quiet resignation of a younger sibling who understood that the performance of proximity was underway and who had chosen not to compete with it. My Aunt Sandra had watched it with the more specific irritation of someone who saw the strategy clearly, but also understood that the house would never go to her because the family's unspoken assumption about how property passed across generations did not include daughters. I had watched it and said nothing because it was not my business, and because I had not known, until the attorney reached into his briefcase, that my grandfather had been watching it too. The second envelope contained two things. The first was a legal document, 6 pages, formally prepared, signed by my grandfather and witnessed by two people I did not recognize. The attorney read it in its entirety. The house on Harleston Village Street was left to me, not to Dale, not to my father, not to the family in shared ownership. To me, Claire Ann Beaumont, granddaughter, architect, with full title, no conditions, no restrictions. Dale made a sound I had never heard from him before. Not words, a sound. The attorney continued reading. The document included a provision that Gloria the housekeeper would be permitted to remain in her current employment for as long as she chose at her current compensation, which would be funded from an account established for that purpose. It included a provision that my father and Aunt Sandra could use the house for family gatherings with reasonable notice to me. It did not include a provision for Dale. When the attorney finished reading the legal document, he paused. Then he picked up the second item from the envelope. A letter, handwritten, 4 pages. My grandfather's architectural print. The careful old handwriting. The attorney said, "Henry asked that this be read aloud in full." Dale said, "Is that necessary?" The attorney looked at him. The attorney said, "Henry was specific." He began to read. If you have ever been the person in a room that nobody expected to matter, you already know why this story exists. Subscribe and hit the bell. I'll be here every week. My grandfather's letter began the way he began most conversations, without preamble. The attorney read, "I am leaving my house to Claire because she is the only one who ever asked about the house itself rather than what would happen to it." The room was completely silent. The attorney continued reading. My grandfather had written that he had watched, for the past 10 years, how different members of his family related to the house on Harleston Village Street. He had watched Dale manage its maintenance with increasing proprietorial energy. He had watched his son Thomas defer to his older brother with the quiet accommodation of a lifetime's habit. He had watched Sandra be excluded from the conversation entirely because nobody had thought to include her. And he had watched Claire visit every month and ask about the load-bearing modifications he had made to the back addition in 1987, and whether the original heart pine floors could be refinished without losing their patina, and what he thought about the way the light moved through the eastern rooms in the late afternoon. He had written, "She asked about the house because she loved it. The others asked about the house because they wanted it. I know the difference. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer. I know the difference between someone who understands what a thing is and someone who is calculating what it is worth." He had written, "Dale has been a good son in many ways and a strategic son in others. I am grateful for the appointments and the repairs and the insurance reviews. I am also aware that these services were rendered with an expectation of return that I never agreed to, and that I do not believe entitles him to what he has been expecting." He had written, "Thomas, you are a kind man who has spent too much of your life making space for other people. I hope this surprises you enough to stop." He had written, "Sandra, I am sorry that the assumption in this family has always been that the house would pass to a son. You deserve to be in the conversation. The fact that you were not is a failure I am trying to partially correct." He had written, "Claire, I have watched you walk through every room of this house for 20 years. I have watched you look at the ceiling joists and the window casings and the way the plaster has settled, and I have never once seen you look at it the way people look at things they plan to own. You look at it the way people look at things they already understand." He had written, "That is who I want to leave it to, someone who already understands it." He had written one final paragraph. The attorney read it. My grandfather had written, I know this will cause difficulty. I have thought about whether to soften it, and I have decided not to. I spent 87 years trying to be precise. I see no reason to stop now." The attorney set down the letter. The room was quiet for a very long time. Dale stood up. He did not say anything. He walked to the door. He opened it. He left. The door did not slam. That was the thing that stayed with me. He closed it quietly, which was somehow worse than if he had slammed it. The quiet closing of a door by a man who had just understood something he had been certain about for 10 years. My father looked at the table. My Aunt Sandra had tears on her face. Not grief tears, something else. The specific expression of someone who has just been told, in a room full of people, that their invisibility had been noticed by the one person whose noticing mattered. I looked at the attorney. I said, "Can I see the letter?" The attorney handed it to me. I read it myself. Not because I hadn't heard it, because I needed to hold it, to feel the weight of 4 pages in my grandfather's handwriting, prepared with the same care he had brought to 40 years of structural engineering and 60 years of living in a house he had understood completely. My hands were not steady. That surprised me. Dale did not speak to me for 3 months. This was his choice, and I did not pursue the conversation. Not because I was avoiding it, because I understood that Dale needed to process something significant and that I was not the right person to help him process it. He needed to grieve the expectation he had built and maintained for 10 years, and that grief required space I was not in a position to give him. My father called me that evening. He was quiet for most of the call. Not upset. Quiet in the way he gets when he is absorbing something slowly. My father said, "I didn't know." I said, "Neither did I." My father said, "He wrote that I spend too much of my life making space for other people." I said, "He did." My father said, "He was right." A long pause. My father said, "He was almost always right." That was the irritating thing about him. I said, "Yes." My father said, "Claire, take care of the house." I said, "I will." I called Gloria the next morning. She had worked for my grandfather for 9 years. She had seen the letter. She had been one of the 2 witnesses to the legal document. I said, "Gloria, I want you to know that the provision in the document stands. Nothing changes on your end unless you decide it does." Gloria said, "Your grandfather told me 6 months ago what he was planning." I said, "He told you?" Gloria said, "He said he wanted one person to know before he was gone. He said he didn't want the only people who knew to be lawyers." I said, "What did he say about it?" Gloria said, "He said he had spent his whole life building things that would last. He said he wanted the house to go to someone who understood that. He said he had been watching for 20 years and he was sure." I sat with that for a long time. 20 years of monthly visits, 20 years of questions about load-bearing walls and heart pine floors and late afternoon light. 20 years of my grandfather watching and deciding. He had been sure. If this moment stayed with you, leave me a comment. Has someone ever seen you clearly from a distance for longer than you knew? Tell me who they were. I read every single one. I moved into the house in January. Not immediately. I needed 3 months to handle the practical details of a life transition that had not been planned. My apartment lease, my office proximity, the specific logistics of moving into a 3,000 square foot house in a neighborhood where parking was a theological debate. The first night I slept there, I walked through every room before I went to bed. Not to assess or plan or measure, just to walk through. The way I had been walking through for 20 years on monthly visits, looking at the ceiling joists and the window casings and the way the plaster had settled. The heart pine floors needed refinishing. Not urgently, they were sound, just worn in the high-traffic corridors. I was not ready to refinish them yet. I wanted to live on them for a year before I decided what to do with them. The eastern rooms caught the light the way my grandfather had always said they did. Late afternoon, oblique. The kind of light that makes old materials look exactly as old as they are without apology. Gloria still came 3 days a week. She knew where everything was and how everything worked, and she had an opinion about every room that she shared when I asked, and kept to herself when I did not. Dale and I had our first real conversation in April, 5 months after the reading of the will. It was not easy, and it was not resolved in one conversation. He was a man who had organized a significant portion of his last decade around an expectation that had not been fulfilled, and he needed to say that clearly before anything else was possible. I let him say it. When he was done, I said, "I understand why you expected it. I also cannot undo what my grandfather decided. What I can do is be thoughtful about how the family uses the house going forward." Dale said, "He left me nothing." I said, "He left you a letter that told you exactly how he saw you. That is not nothing. It is uncomfortable, but it is not nothing." He was quiet for a long time. Dale said, "He said I was strategic." I said, "He said you were a good son in many ways and strategic in others. That is what he wrote." Dale said, "It feels like an accusation." I said, "I think he meant it as an observation. He was precise about the difference." Another long silence. Dale said, "He was always precise." I said, "Yes, that was not a resolution. It was a beginning. There is a difference." I am 32 years old, and my grandfather left me a house I had not been expecting and a letter that told me why. I want to tell you what I actually learned from this, rather than the version that sounds like a lesson. The first thing, the people who are watching are not always the people who are talking. My grandfather said very little about his intentions for 20 years. He did not tell me he was watching. He did not indicate that my monthly visits were being assessed. He was simply present, and I was simply present, and the relationship we had was what it was, genuine and specific, and not performed for anyone's benefit. What he saw in those visits was real because it was not staged for his benefit. I asked about the ceiling joists because I found them interesting. I asked about the floors because they were beautiful and I wanted to understand how they had survived. I came every month because I liked coming. The lesson is not to perform interest in old houses in front of elderly relatives. The lesson is that genuine attention is visible to the people who have been paying it for decades. You do not have to announce it. You do not have to compete for it. You simply have to be the person who actually shows up and actually cares and actually asks the questions they want to ask, rather than the questions that seem strategic. The second thing is about Dale and what his story actually is. Dale did genuine things for my grandfather for many years. The appointments, the repairs, the insurance reviews, these were real contributions to a real person's life. The fact that they were accompanied by strategic intent does not erase that they were also real. What they were not was the thing my grandfather valued most. My grandfather valued someone who understood what the house was, not someone who was managing the conditions under which they would eventually receive it. This is not a unique situation. It happens in families with money and families without money, and families where the thing being contested is not a house, but a piece of land or a business, or simply the question of who mattered most to the person who is gone. The people who show up for strategic reasons and the people who show up because they want to be there are sometimes the same people doing the same things. The difference is internal and invisible most of the time. It was not invisible to my grandfather. The third thing is the hardest and the most personal. I did not know I was being seen that clearly for 20 years. I did not know that the conversations about load-bearing walls and heart pine floors and late afternoon light were being held and remembered and weighed by a man who was making a decision about what would outlast him. I think about that sometimes, about how much of what we do in relationships is visible to the other person in ways we are not aware of, about the fact that the people who matter to us are forming impressions of who we are in every interaction, and that those impressions accumulate over decades into something as specific and considered as a 4-page handwritten letter. My grandfather spent 87 years trying to be precise. He saw no reason to stop. I am trying to deserve the house. Not by maintaining it perfectly, or improving it strategically, or managing it well, by understanding it, By asking the right questions. By paying the kind of attention that my grandfather recognized across 20 years of monthly visits, because it was the same attention he had paid to everything he had ever built. That is what he left me the house for. That is what I am trying to earn. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever seen you more clearly than you knew for longer than you realized? And which moment stayed with you longer? The attorney reading the letter out loud, or Dale closing the door quietly on his way out? I read every single one. If this story reached you today, subscribe. What comes next will stay with you too. Claire Beaumont, Charleston, South Carolina.